It's one of the reasons that LeBron is so great. I refuse to get into the GOAT debate. I don't care. They didn't play against each other. I do not care. What makes him great, well, a bunch of things, but what has made him great is the fact that he's done it now for 21 years at the highest level. I think it's fair to just say there are different tiers of greatness. By the way, a lot of times we're comparing eras, we're comparing different rules, we're comparing the fact that, like I'll say this with Michael Jordan, and I don't mean this to be controversial, but like everybody talks about all these, the context of this era. Michael Jordan, the Dallas Mavericks were added as the 23rd team in 1981. Jordan was drafted. During his heyday, 6 teams were added to the NBA. There were 90 players added to the NBA. Does that not water down? I'm not talking playoffs, by the way. No chance we're talking playoffs. Does that not water down the regular season to a degree? You lived it, right? You played against some of those teams. You played against the Bobcats. If we add 2 teams in 2 or 3 years, we get a Vegas franchise or a Seattle franchise, you're not telling me that the league for a little bit is going to be a little watered down?
Maybe, a little bit.
So as you just saw, JJ Redick is back at it again, dropping some of those controversial takes that are sure to rile people up, while literally claiming that he's not trying to be controversial. In this one clip, he mentioned that he doesn't care about the GOAT conversation at all, and then he immediately followed it up by taking a shot specifically at Jordan's era. As for myself personally, I no longer get frustrated with JJ's takes about old school eras, because to be completely honest, the shade is kind of expected at this point. After starting a podcast with LeBron James, and after the rumors swirling about the Lakers head coaching spot, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that JJ is saying things that supports his friend and his fellow podcaster. But the question is, with all of that being said, does the man have a point? Was the 90s actually a watered down era? And is that a legitimate criticism when looking at the GOAT debate? Today, I'll do my best to answer that, as I explain the details of how the expansion worked. Starting things off, let's look at the basics of how the league expanded. At the end of the 1987 to 1988 NBA season, there were 23 teams in the league. With the popularity of the game reaching record heights, the league office desired to expand their product and bring more NBA teams to more cities, which would naturally and dramatically increase revenue over time. Between the 88 to 89 season and the 95 to 96 season, the league added 6 more teams, which increased the total number of franchises to 29. Those teams were the Miami Heat and the Charlotte Hornets in 1988, the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Orlando Magic in 1989, and the Toronto Raptors and the Vancouver Grizzlies in 1995. Now here's the thing, most people don't even understand how these teams were formulated. Contrary to popular belief, they weren't just picking up random water boys and semi-athletic fans out of the stands. But first and foremost, the expansion teams were able to pick players from the other 23 teams in the league. But obviously, they couldn't just pick any players that they wanted. Otherwise, an expansion team would become an overpowered super team in their first season. There were specific rules in place for the expansion draft, and the first one is that each pre-existing team in the league could protect up to 8 players on their roster, but after that, everyone else was up for grabs. The second major rule was that each team in the league would only give up 1 player in order to form the 2 expansion teams. Obviously, this wouldn't leave many immediate all-stars for the expansion teams to select, but they were able to get some quality pieces, like the famous enforcer Rick Mahorn, the prolific scorer Reggie Theus, and the NBA's record holder for the most assists in a single game, Scott Skiles. Now you can act like the Bulls dynasty always benefited from these expansions, but the truth is they were actually hurt by it in some instances. For example, BJ Armstrong was one of the best 3-point shooters in the entire league, and had just been an NBA All-Star the year prior. But because of the expansion draft in 1995, he was taken from the Bulls with the first overall pick, severely weakening the strength of Chicago's roster. So ultimately, an important detail to remember is that the expansion teams were made up of quality NBA players, and it was the responsibility of the other 23 teams, Bulls included, to then fill their roster spot, with either a player from the draft or through free agency. So now that we understand how the expansion teams were created, and that it wasn't just a collection of scrubs like JJ Redick makes it seem, it's time for me to make my next major point. Expansion teams typically don't stay awful for very long. The NBA is constructed in such a way where it's a league that tries to naturally maintain a competitive balance. Although expansion teams don't have many all-star level players in their first season, they do start accumulating top draft lottery picks rather quickly, thanks to their low seeding. And it's also worth mentioning that they usually have plenty of cap space to make moves in the offseason. Sure, the Charlotte Hornets began playing in the 88-89 season, but by the 92-93 season, they had a stacked roster, with stars like Alonzo Mourning, Larry Johnson, and Kendall Gill, and made it all the way to the Eastern Conference semifinals. The Miami Heat also began playing in the 88-89 season, but they were a playoff team by the 91-92 season, and by the 96-97 season, they were legitimate title contenders, who were stacked with all-stars, won 61 games, and made it all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals. Then you had the Orlando Magic and the Minnesota Timberwolves, who began playing in the 89-90 season. Yes, the Wolves were bad, and stayed bad for a long time. But at this point, I think we can tell that this was mostly because of bad management, and not necessarily because they were an expansion team. The Orlando Magic were able to get guys like Shaquille O'Neal and Penny Hardaway because of their low seeding, and by 1994, they were legitimate title contenders. They were the only team to eliminate Jordan's Bulls after they begun winning championships, and the Magic even went on to the NBA Finals in 1995. So what I just explained is that 3 out of those first 4 expansion teams were not only decent, but were extremely competitive within a few years. Before the Bulls even started their second three-peat, 3 out of those 4 teams were legitimate obstacles for Chicago. Now for the last 2 expansion teams, you have the Toronto Raptors and the Vancouver Grizzlies, who began playing basketball in the 95-96 season. And yes, those 2 teams did stay awful throughout the entirety of the Bulls' second three-peat. So here's what you need to consider. In the 95-96 season, where the Bulls famously finished with a 72-10 record, the Grizzlies were in the West and the Raptors were in the East. In that record-breaking regular season, the Bulls had a 2-0 record against the Grizzlies and a 3-1 record against the Raptors. Now, if those expansion teams didn't exist, and those 5 victories were against regular NBA teams instead, then yeah, it's at least possible that the Bulls win less games, and maybe they finish with 69 or 70 wins instead of 72. But I mean, in order for that to happen, you have to assume that the Bulls would have had a 3-3 record against the average NBA team. And considering the fact that they went 67-9 against the rest of the league that season, I would say that that's a pretty big assumption. I think you guys are starting to see my point. The impact that the expansion era had on the Bulls dynasty is negligible when you understand the full context. If you were to go back in time in the summer of 1995 and you were to ask the Bulls management, would they rather keep their sharpshooter BJ Armstrong, or would they rather not have the Toronto Raptors standing in their path in the Eastern Conference? I think their answer would be rather obvious. Of course, they would rather keep their quality player. Now imagine, it's 1998, Michael Jordan just epically defeated the Utah Jazz with a 45-point performance in Game 6 of the NBA Finals to win his 6th championship and 6th Finals MVP. And in an interview, you get to tell MJ to his face that he's not the greatest player of all time because the Toronto Raptors and the Vancouver Grizzlies exist. Yeah. Someone needs to tell JJ Redick that that's as ridiculous as it sounds.